Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a subject that's essential for anyone studying economics, the classical school.
Yeah,
Those revolutionary thinkers who laid the groundwork for modern economics.
exactly.
We're going to break down their key ideas, introduce you to the big names, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and highlight the concepts that often pop up on exams.
That's right.
And the best part, this Deep Dive is brought to you by Grade Guru. So for practice exams and a full summary of everything we covered today, head over to gradeguru.nl. It's like having a cheat sheet for your brain.
That's right. It's true. The classical school is foundational to understanding economics, and grasping these concepts can be a real game changer, especially when it comes to exams.
All right, so let's set the stage. The classical school dominated economic thought from around 1776 to 1871.
Hmm.
Now, this period wasn't just about powdered wigs and revolutions. It was a time of immense intellectual and technological upheaval. What's really fascinating is how these revolutions directly shaped the ideas of the classical economists.
Exactly. You're spot on. Think about the scientific revolution. It emphasized natural laws and reason, leading to the idea of laissez-faire economics, which essentially means minimal government intervention. The Enlightenment, happening concurrently, further bolstered this, with its focus on individual liberty and the power of reason.
So, while scientists were busy uncovering the laws of physics, economists were trying to discover the laws governing the economy.
Precisely. And then came the Industrial Revolution, a period of booming industry, fierce competition, and unfortunately, a lot of workers struggling with low wages. This context is crucial because it directly shaped how classical economists viewed labor and the dynamics of production.
It sounds like they were witnessing the birth pangs of modern capitalism,
Yeah.
with all its complexities and contradictions.
Yeah.
So how did they try to make sense of this new economic landscape? Were there any unifying principles or ideas that tied them together?
Absolutely. There were several core principles that formed the bedrock of classical economic thought, and understanding these is vital for acing those exams. Firstly, they were strong advocates for limited government intervention in the economy. They believed the government's role should be confined to protecting property rights, providing public education, and ensuring national defense. Everything else, leave it to the free market.
A pretty hands-off approach.
Yeah.
What else was central to their thinking?
They believed individuals are fundamentally driven by self-interest. Now, this might sound a bit cynical, but they saw this self-interest as the engine of economic activity. Businesses chasing profits, workers seeking higher wages. It's all part of this self-interested drive that, according to classical economists, fuels economic growth and innovation.
Everyone acting in their own self-interest somehow leads to a better society. I'm not sure I'm buying that. Wouldn't that just create chaos and inequality?
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to one of the most famous and often misunderstood concepts of the classical school, the harmony of interests. They argued that individuals pursuing their self-interest within the framework of a free market unintentionally benefit society as a whole. Think of it like an invisible hand guiding individual actions towards a collective good.
Okay. That's starting to make a bit more sense.
Yeah.
But how exactly does this invisible hand work? Is it some kind of magical force?
Not magic, but certainly powerful. Imagine you're a baker and you want to make a profit. You'll bake the best bread you can and sell it at a price people are willing to pay. You're acting in your own self-interest. But in doing so, you're providing a valuable good to your community. Now, multiply that across every business and worker in the economy, and you have a system where self-interest, guided by competition and market forces, actually promotes efficiency, innovation, and ultimately benefits society as a whole.
So almost like a paradox. Individual self-interest, when channeled through the free market, can actually lead to collective well-being.
Exactly. And this is a key idea that distinguishes the classical school from other economic schools of thought.
All right. That's a pretty mind-bending concept, but I
Yeah.
think I'm starting to grasp it now. What about the role of different economic resources? Did the classical economists have any specific views on this?
Definitely. They emphasize that all economic resources and activities contribute to economic wealth, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. They saw these as the building blocks of a thriving economy, and they didn't prioritize one sector over another: agriculture, commerce, production, international trade. It was all part of this interconnected system that they were trying to understand.
So they were looking at the big picture, trying to figure out how all the pieces of the economic puzzle fit together. It's almost like they were the original systems thinkers, trying to map out the complex web of economic relationships.
That's a great way to put it. And one of their main goals was to identify the universal economic laws that governed this complex system. They believed that just like the laws of physics, there were underlying economic laws that determined how the economy functioned.
So they were looking for the economic equivalent of Newton's laws of motion.
Fascinating. Did they come up with any specific laws, the kind of stuff that might show up on an exam?
They did. Some of the most famous ones include the law of comparative advantage, the law of diminishing returns, and the labor theory of value. These laws attempt to explain things like why nations trade, how the price of goods is determined, and why adding more resources doesn't always lead to proportionally higher output. Don't worry.
Right.
We'll delve into these in more detail as we discuss the specific economists who developed them.
Okay, that's super helpful. So we've laid out the historical context and the core principles of the classical school. Now, let's talk about the rock stars of this school, the economists whose names are synonymous with these groundbreaking ideas.
Sounds good. And there's no better place to start than with the father of economics himself, Adam Smith.
Yes. Adam Smith, I remember reading about him in my textbook. He's the guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations, right? That massive book that's considered the Bible of economics. That's the one. The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, is considered a landmark work that laid the foundation for modern economics. It's incredibly comprehensive, covering everything from price theory and the division of labor to capital accumulation, international trade, and the role of government in the economy.
Wow. That's quite a range of topics. It sounds like it's packed with information. Where do we even begin with a book like that?
Let's start with one of the most fundamental concepts in economics, price theory. Smith made a crucial distinction between what he called value in use and value in exchange. Value in use refers to how useful a good is, its practical utility. Value in exchange, on the other hand, refers to what a good can be traded for in the market.
So, for example, water has a high value in use because it's essential for life, but it might have a low value in exchange because it's relatively abundant. Diamonds, on the other hand, have a high value in exchange because they're rare and sought after, even though their practical use is limited.
That's a perfect example. And this distinction between value in use and value in exchange is key to understanding Smith's labor theory of value.
Okay. I remember reading about the labor theory of value. Can you refresh my memory on that one?
The labor theory of value essentially argues that the price of a good is primarily determined by the amount of labor required to produce it. The more labor it takes to produce a good, the higher its price should be.
So, a handmade sweater that takes hours to knit should cost more than a mass-produced sweater that's churned out by machines in minutes, even if they're both made from the same type of wool.
Exactly. Now, the labor theory of value has been debated and refined by economists over the years, but it was a central idea in Smith's work and a major contribution to classical economic thought.
That makes sense. It highlights the importance of human effort and skill in creating economic value. But didn't Smith also recognize the importance of efficiency and productivity?
He did. Remember the Industrial Revolution we talked about earlier? Smith witnessed firsthand how the division of labor and specialization could dramatically increase productivity. He used the famous example of a pin factory to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah. The pin factory. Can you remind us how that worked?
Imagine one person trying to make an entire pin from start to finish, drawing the wire, straightening it, cutting it, sharpening it, and so on. It would be a slow and laborious process. But if you break down the pin-making process into a series of specialized tasks, with each worker focusing on just one step, you can produce pins much faster and more efficiently.
It's like an assembly line.
Right.
Each worker becomes an expert in their specific task,
Yeah.
and the overall production process becomes much smoother and faster.
Right.
Smith saw this division of labor as a key driver of economic growth.
Absolutely. He believed that specialization and the division of labor were essential for increasing productivity, reducing costs, and ultimately creating more wealth.
And this concept is still relevant today, as we see in modern factories and global supply chains.
That's a great point. It shows how Smith's insights about the organization of production are still shaping the way we make things today. Now, let's talk about one of Smith's most famous and influential concepts, the invisible hand. You mentioned it earlier, but can you explain it in more detail? Of course. As we discussed, the invisible hand is the idea that individuals, acting in their own self-interest, unintentionally promote the well-being of society as a whole. It's a concept that often comes up on exams, so it's important to understand it thoroughly.
Okay. I'm ready for another mind-bending economics lesson.
Yeah.
How does this invisible hand actually work? Is this some kind of mystical force?
Not mystical, but certainly powerful. Think of it this way. A baker wants to make money. To do that, they bake the tastiest bread they can and sell it at a price people are willing to pay. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it to make a profit. But in the process, they're providing a valuable good to their community. Multiply that across every business and worker in the economy. And you have a system where self-interest, guided by competition, actually promotes innovation, efficiency, and ultimately benefits everyone. The invisible hand is just a metaphor for the market forces of supply and demand at work, guiding individuals to make choices that may aggregate benefit society as a whole.
It's there.
Yeah.
Well, it's not about being altruistic. It's about competition and everyone trying to do what's best for themselves. It's almost counterintuitive. But I can see how it might work. What did Smith have to say about international trade?
Smith was a big critic of mercantilism, which was the dominant economic policy of his time. Mercantilists believed that a country should maximize exports and minimize imports, hoarding gold and silver to increase its wealth.
So they basically wanted to win at trade, treating it like a zero-sum game where one country's gain is another country's loss.
Exactly. But Smith argued that trade was not a zero-sum game. He believed that free trade was a win-win situation that could benefit all countries involved. He argued for free trade, believing that countries should specialize in producing what they're best at and trade for other goods. He even used the example of wine and cloth production in England and Portugal to demonstrate this. Even if Portugal could produce both wine and cloth more efficiently than England, it still made sense for Portugal to specialize in wine production, where its advantage was greatest, and trade with England for cloth.
So, by specializing and trading, both countries could end up with more wine and cloth than if they tried to produce everything themselves. And that leads to greater overall wealth and prosperity for both countries. It's like a division of labor, but on a global scale.
That's a great way to put it. Smith believed that free trade allowed countries to leverage their comparative advantages, leading to greater efficiency, lower prices, and a wider variety of goods for consumers.
Okay, so Smith was a champion of free markets and limited government, but surely he recognized that the government has some role to play in the economy, right? I mean, even the most ardent free market advocates acknowledge the need for some government intervention.
Of course, Smith wasn't an anarchist. He believed that the government did have an important, albeit limited, role to play in the economy. He argued that the government should focus on protecting property rights, enforcing contracts, and providing public goods like infrastructure and education, things that the market might not provide efficiently on its own.
So, it's not about eliminating the government altogether, but about defining its role in a way that supports and complements the free market.
Exactly. Smith saw these functions as essential for a well-functioning economy.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with Adam Smith. He definitely laid the intellectual groundwork for the classical school. But he wasn't the only influential thinker in this school, was he? What about Thomas Malthus? Didn't he have some rather pessimistic views on population growth?
Ah, yes. Thomas Malthus, the economist who put a bit of a damper on the party. He's best known for his rather gloomy predictions about the relationship between population growth and resource scarcity.
I remember reading about Malthus. Wasn't he the guy who predicted that we'd all eventually starve to death? Because there wouldn't be enough food to go around.
He did tend to focus on the potential downsides of population growth, but to be fair to Malthus, he was writing at a time when poverty and unemployment were widespread.
So, context is important. But what exactly was Malthus's population theory all about?
Malthus argued that population grows geometrically, like 1, 2.4.8, while food production grows arithmetically, like 1.2.3.4. This means that population has the potential to increase much faster than our ability to produce food. And this imbalance, he predicted, would inevitably lead to famine, disease, and poverty.
He was painting a rather bleak picture of the future.
He was. But Malthus also believed there were checks on population growth that could prevent us from spiraling into total catastrophe. He categorized these checks into preventive checks, which lower the birth rate, and positive checks, which increase the death rate.
Okay, that sounds a bit ominous. What exactly did he mean by positive checks?
Well, his positive checks included things like famine, disease, and war. Not exactly cheerful topics for a podcast.
I can see why you got a reputation for being a bit of a pessimist. And what about the preventive checks? Were those a bit less grim?
His preventative checks were things like moral restraint, which basically meant delaying marriage and having fewer children. He also argued that poverty itself acted as a check on population growth, as poor families struggled to feed and care for large numbers of children.
So he wasn't necessarily advocating for war and famine, but he saw them as inevitable consequences if population growth wasn't kept in check. And he saw poverty and delayed marriage as natural ways to limit population growth.
Exactly. Now, Malthus's theory has been criticized and debated over the years, and his predictions about mass starvation haven't come to pass. However, his work highlighted the potential for resource scarcity and the challenges of balancing population growth with sustainable development, issues that are still relevant today.
It's interesting how his ideas, while controversial, continue to resonate with contemporary concerns about overpopulation and environmental sustainability. It shows how the classical economists were grappling with some fundamental questions about human society and its relationship with the natural world.
You're absolutely right. Now, Malthus's contributions to economics went beyond his population theory. He also developed the theory of market gluts, suggesting that there could be times when there's not enough demand in the economy to buy up all the goods and services being produced.
Wait a minute, I thought C's law said that supply creates its own demand. Didn't we learn that from Adam Smith?
You're right. Say's law was a core principle of classical economics. But Malthus challenged that idea, arguing that sometimes there could be a general glut of commodities. He pointed out that if workers are only paid a subsistence wage, they won't be able to buy back all the goods they produce, leading to a surplus of goods and a slump in economic activity.
So, where does all that extra stuff go? Who buys it?
Malthus believed that landlords played a crucial role in consuming excess goods and preventing economic stagnation. He thought their spending on luxury goods and services helped to prop up demand.
So, in a way,
Mm-hmm.
he was saying that inequality, with landlords having a lot more wealth than workers, was actually necessary to keep the economy running smoothly.
It was a controversial argument, to say the least. But it highlights the potential for problems if demand isn't sufficient to match supply.
It seems like Malthus was raising some important questions, even if his solutions were a bit out there. What kind of impact did his ideas have on economic policy at the time?
Well, his population theory was used to justify some rather harsh policies, like the Poor Laws of 1834, which made it very difficult for poor people to get government assistance. The idea was that helping the poor would just encourage them to have more children, which would further strain the already limited resources.
So a very tough love approach to poverty, based on the assumption that helping the poor would just exacerbate the problem of overpopulation. It's a reminder of how economic theories, even if well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences.
Precisely. And it's also important to remember that economics is not a value-neutral science. It's always embedded in social and political contexts. And economic theories can be used to justify a wide range of policies, some of which are more equitable and humane than others.
That's an important point. It reminds us to be critical thinkers when engaging with economic ideas, and to consider the potential social and ethical implications of different policies.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of influential classical economists, we can't forget David Ricardo. He's another name that's sure to pop up on your exams. So let's delve into his key contributions.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle another economic giant. What was Ricardo best known for?
Ricardo was a brilliant economist who refined and expanded on many of Smith's ideas, and he wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. He's perhaps best known for his work on international trade, particularly the theory of comparative advantage and his theory of rent, which explains how land scarcity and varying land quality lead to rent payments.
I remember reading about comparative advantage. It has something to do with countries specializing in what they're best at producing.
Right. You're exactly right. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage argues that countries should specialize in producing goods and services that they can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries.
Now, hold on a minute. What exactly is opportunity cost? It's one of those terms that always get mixed up.
Opportunity cost is a fundamental concept in economics, and it's essential for understanding comparative advantage. It basically refers to what you have to give up to get something else. It's the value of the next best alternative.
Okay, so if I spend an hour studying economics, the opportunity cost is whatever else I could have done with that hour, like watching a movie, hanging out with friends, or earning money at my part-time job.
Exactly. And in the context of international trade, opportunity cost refers to what a country has to forego in terms of producing one good in order to produce another good.
So it's not just about what a country is good at producing. Expert.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the classical school of economics.
All right, let's pick up where we left off. We've covered some of the giants of classical economics,
Yeah.
Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo, and now it's time to explore John Stuart Mill, who really straddled the line between the classical and neoclassical schools.
You're right on the money. Mill was deeply influenced by those who came before him. But he also saw some limitations in their theories, particularly when it came to the role of demand in shaping prices.
Yeah, that's something that stuck with me from our last discussion. The classical economists seemed to focus heavily on supply, production costs, labor. But what about the buyers? Don't they have a say in how prices are set?
Absolutely. And that's one of Mill's key contributions. He brought demand into the equation, arguing that prices are ultimately determined by the interaction of both supply and demand. He recognized that if no one wants to buy something, it doesn't matter how cheaply it can be produced.
That makes perfect sense.
Wow.
It's not just about the cost of making something, but also how much people are willing to pay for it.
Exactly. And he went further by exploring the concept of price elasticity, which measures how sensitive demand is to price changes. Think about it. If the price of a luxury good, like a designer handbag, goes up, people might buy a lot less because they can easily choose other options. But if the price of something essential, like gasoline, increases, people might still buy almost as much because they need it.
So the demand for some goods is much more sensitive to price changes than others. That's a really important insight. And it makes me think about how businesses try to figure out the sweet spot for pricing their products. They need to find that balance between maximizing profits and not scaring away customers.
Exactly. And Mill's work on price elasticity was a stepping stone toward understanding consumer behavior and how businesses set prices in the real world.
It sounds like he was laying the groundwork for the later neoclassical economists who really dug deep into individual decision-making and utility maximization.
He absolutely was. Now, another area where Mill challenged the classical orthodoxy was the wage fund theory.
Right. The wage fund theory, if I remember correctly. It basically said that there's a fixed amount of capital available to pay wages. So if the number of workers increases, each worker gets a smaller slice of the pie.
That's the gist of it.
Mm-hmm.
But Mill saw some problems with this theory. He observed that trade unions were able to negotiate higher wages for their members, which didn't quite fit with the idea of a fixed wage fund.
So if wages could be pushed higher through collective bargaining, then maybe the wage fund wasn't so fixed after all.
Precisely. Mill's questioning of the wage fund theory opened the door for new theories of wage determination. It helped economists start thinking about wages, not just as a fixed cost, but as a variable that could be influenced by various factors, including worker bargaining power.
It's fascinating how Mill was constantly challenging the status quo and pushing economic thinking forward. He seems to have had a real knack for identifying the weaknesses in existing theories and proposing new ways of thinking about things.
That's what makes him such a pivotal figure in the history of economic thought. He was a product of the classical school, but he was also instrumental in paving the way for the neoclassical revolution. He was grappling with the same fundamental questions about how economies work, but he was also starting to see that some of the classical answers were incomplete or needed refinement.
So he was a bridge between two major schools of thought in economics.
Exactly. His contributions extended beyond the specific theories we've discussed. He wrote extensively on political philosophy, ethics, and social justice. He was a strong advocate for individual liberty, women's rights, and social reform. He believed that economics should serve the betterment of humanity, not just the accumulation of wealth.
It's really impressive how he was able to connect economics to broader social and ethical concerns. He sounds like a true visionary.
He was a true Renaissance man of the 19th century. Now, since we're talking about Mill as a bridge between two schools of thought, I think it's important to understand some of the key differences between the classical and neoclassical approaches to economics.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What were some of the key distinctions between these two schools?
One major difference lies in their focus. Classical economists were primarily concerned with macro-level issues like national wealth, economic growth, and the distribution of income between classes. Neoclassical economists, however, shifted their attention to micro-level decision-making, how individuals, both consumers and producers, make choices at the margin.
It's like they were zooming in on the individual actors within the economy, trying to understand the motivations and calculations that drive their decisions.
Exactly. They were interested in questions like, how does a consumer decide how much of a particular good to buy? How does a firm decide how much to produce and what price to charge? What factors influence these choices?
And these decisions are all about comparing the costs and benefits of one more unit. That's the whole idea of marginal analysis, right?
You got it. The neoclassical economists developed sophisticated mathematical tools to model these marginal decision-making processes. They also emphasized the role of individual preferences and utility maximization in driving economic behavior.
So, they were getting into the psychology of economics, trying to understand what motivates people to make the choices they do. It's like they were trying to build a more nuanced and realistic model of how people behave in economic situations.
That's a great way to put it. And this focus on individual decision-making and utility maximization had a profound impact on how economists thought about markets and the role of prices.
Can you give us an example of how this new way of thinking changed economic theory?
Let's consider the classic example of supply and demand. The classical economists understood the basic principles of supply and demand, but their analysis was often quite informal. The neoclassical economists, however, formalized these concepts using precise mathematical models, showing how the intersection of supply and demand curves determines the equilibrium price and quantity in a market.
So, they were making economics more rigorous and scientific, using math to model how markets work.
Exactly, and this more rigorous approach allowed them to develop more sophisticated theories about consumer behavior, firm behavior, and market competition.
It sounds like the neoclassical economists were building on the foundations laid by the classical school, but they were also taking economics in a new direction, using new tools and new methods of analysis. That's a great summary. The transition from classical to neoclassical economics was a complex and fascinating process, and John Stuart Mill, with his deep understanding of both traditions, played a key role in that transition. It's amazing how influential he was, given that he lived in the 19th century. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to touch upon something we discussed earlier. Right. You mentioned that the classical school, despite its many contributions, also had its limitations.
Yes, absolutely. No school of thought has all the answers. And even the most brilliant economists can make mistakes or overlook important factors. The classical economists were products of their time, and some of their assumptions and conclusions might seem outdated or even problematic today. What were some of the main criticisms of the classical school? Where did their theories fall short?
One major criticism is that they often oversimplified the complexities of real-world economies. They tended to assume perfect competition, rational self-interest, and frictionless markets, which don't always reflect the messy realities of how economies actually function.
So, their models were a bit too idealized, not quite capturing the nuances and imperfections of real-world markets.
That's right. And this led to some blind spots in their theories. For example, they didn't fully appreciate the role of institutions, social norms, and power dynamics in shaping economic outcomes.
They were so focused on the mechanics of the market that they sometimes missed the bigger social and political context in which markets operate.
Precisely, and this led to some rather problematic policy prescriptions. For example, their emphasis on laissez-faire economics sometimes led to a neglect of important social problems like poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation. They sometimes fail to see how market forces, left unchecked, could exacerbate these problems.
So, while they made groundbreaking contributions to economic theory, they also left some important questions unanswered. And some of their ideas had unintended consequences.
That's a really important point to remember. It reminds us to be critical thinkers when engaging with economic theories. Even those that have been highly influential, we need to consider their limitations and potential biases, as well as their historical context.
That's a great reminder. Now, speaking of historical context, let's go back to the classical school's emphasis on economic growth. They were all about making the economic pie bigger.
Right? Yes. They saw economic growth as the key to improving living standards and reducing poverty, and they had some really insightful ideas about how to achieve it.
What were some of their key insights into the drivers of economic growth?
They believed that capital accumulation, free trade, and technological innovation were essential for driving economic growth. They argued that by investing in capital, expanding trade, and encouraging innovation, societies could increase their productivity and raise living standards for everyone.
Sounds like a pretty solid recipe for economic progress.
It's a recipe that has been very influential, and many of these ideas are still central to economic policy today. Economists continue to study the factors that contribute to economic growth and to debate the best policies to promote it.
So, the classical school's legacy lives on.
It certainly does. Despite its limitations, the classical school of economics made profound contributions to our understanding of how economies work. Their ideas about free markets, self-interest, Competition and economic growth continue to shape economic policy debates and influence our lives in countless ways.
Well, I think that's a great place to pause our deep dive into the classical school. It's been a fascinating journey through some of the most influential ideas in the history of economic thought.
It has, and remember, if you're studying for an economics exam, Grade Guru has all the resources you need to ace it. Just head over to gradeguru.nl for practice exams, summaries, and more. You'll find everything you need to master these classical economics concepts.
That's right. GradeGuru.nl is your one-stop shop for all things economics. And be sure to join us for the next part of our deep dive, where we'll wrap things up by revisiting some key themes and highlighting the lasting impact of classical economic thought. Until then, happy studying. Welcome back to the deep dive. I'm really starting to see how the classical school, despite being centuries old, still has relevance in today's world.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how their ideas continue to resonate in modern economic debates, especially their views on the role of government.
Yes, the idea of limited government intervention, that was a core principle for them, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Classical economists firmly believed that markets generally self-regulate, and government intervention often does more harm than good. They argued that prices, wages, and other economic variables would naturally adjust to reach an efficient allocation of resources, and meddling with this process could distort those natural mechanisms.
So they were all about letting the free market do its thing, keeping the government's hands off as much as possible.
Essentially, yes. They saw the government's role as mainly focused on protecting property rights, enforcing contracts, and providing a few essential public goods, like national defense and infrastructure. Anything beyond that, they argued, could stifle innovation and hinder economic growth.
It's interesting how this concept of limited government remains so influential today. It forms the bedrock of many conservative and libertarian economic philosophies, doesn't it?
You're exactly right. The classical school's advocacy for free markets and limited government has had a lasting impact on economic policy debates across the globe. It's often cited as a justification for policies like deregulation, privatization, and free trade agreements.
Even though these economists were writing centuries ago, their ideas still find a voice in contemporary policy discussions.
They do. Now, moving on to another key theme that we've touched upon throughout our deep dive, the role of self-interest and competition.
Ah, yes, Adam Smith's invisible hand. The idea that individuals acting in their own self-interest can actually end up benefiting society as a whole.
Precisely. Classical economists believe that competition within a free market acts like an invisible hand, guiding self-interested individuals towards choices that promote overall economic well-being. They saw competition as a powerful force for innovation, efficiency, and lower prices for consumers.
So it's not about altruism. It's more about everyone striving to improve their own situation. And through that process, making the economic pie bigger for everyone.
That's a good way to summarize it, of course. This idea has been debated and challenged over the years. Critics argue that unchecked self-interest can lead to exploitation, inequality, and environmental damage. They highlight the need for ethical considerations and responsible regulation to ensure that markets serve the common good.
So, it's not a perfect system by any means. And the role of ethical considerations and responsible regulation is something that has been increasingly emphasized, especially in light of issues like climate change and income inequality.
Definitely. But the core concept of self-interest as a driving force in economics remains a fundamental principle in modern economic thinking. It forms the basis of market-based economic systems and continues to inform our understanding of how economies function.
Okay, let's move on to something that often sparks debate. The classical school's views on poverty and inequality.
Yes, this is a topic that often generates strong opinions. Classical economists generally viewed poverty and inequality as natural outcomes of a market economy.
Meaning, they didn't see them as problems that needed fixing.
They argued that wages are determined by the supply and demand for labor, and that some level of inequality is necessary to incentivize hard work and innovation. They believed that attempts to redistribute wealth or artificially raise wages would interfere with the natural workings of the market and could lead to unintended negative consequences.
So, they were against things like minimum wage laws or social welfare programs.
Generally, yes. They argued that such interventions would distort market signals and could ultimately harm those they were intended to help. For instance, they believed minimum wage laws would lead to unemployment by making it too expensive for businesses to hire low-skilled workers.
It's a perspective that certainly wouldn't sit well with many people today.
You're right. It's a reminder that economics is not just a set of abstract theories. It's deeply intertwined with social and ethical values. The classical economists' views on poverty and inequality were shaped by the historical context in which they were writing, a time when industrial capitalism was rapidly transforming society, but also creating new forms of hardship and disparity.
So their theories were a reflection of their time, and
So-
those theories have been challenged and revised as our understanding of economics and social justice has evolved.
Absolutely. The debate about the role of government in addressing poverty and inequality continues to this day. Modern economists from a variety of perspectives grapple with these issues and explore ways to promote economic opportunity and social justice within the framework of a market economy.
It's a reminder that economics is a constantly evolving field, constantly adapting to new challenges and new ideas. It's not a static set of doctrines. It's a dynamic process of inquiry and debate.
Well said.
Oh.
Now, before we conclude our deep dive, I want to highlight one more lasting contribution of the classical school: their emphasis on economic growth.
They were all about expanding the economic pie for everyone, weren't they?
They believed that economic growth was the key to improving living standards and addressing social problems, and they emphasized several key drivers of growth.
What were some of their key insights into how to achieve economic growth?
They focus on factors like capital accumulation, free trade, and technological innovation. They argued that investing in capital, expanding trade, and fostering innovation could significantly boost productivity and lead to widespread economic prosperity.
It's interesting how these ideas continue to be central to economic policy discussions today. Governments around the world are still striving to create conditions that foster investment, encourage innovation, and promote open markets.
You're absolutely right. Those ideas, though originating centuries ago, still hold relevance in shaping policy decisions and addressing economic challenges.
So, the classical school's legacy truly lives on, shaping our understanding of economics and influencing policy decisions even today.
It does. Despite its limitations, the classical school's contributions to economic thought have been profound and enduring. Their insights about free markets, self-interest, competition, and economic growth continue to inform our understanding of how economies work and how we can create a more prosperous future.
Oh, I think this wraps up our deep dive into the classical school of economics. It's been an incredibly insightful journey through some of the most influential ideas in the history of economic thought.
I agree. And remember, if you're studying for an economics exam and want to delve deeper into these concepts, Grade Guru is here to help. Just visit gradeguru.nl for practice exams, summaries, and more.
That's right, gradeguru.nl has all the resources you need to ace those exams and master the ideas of the classical school. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and until next time, keep those economic gears turning.